To the live stream of stuff. Today, we are going to talk about Martin Luther King Jr. and what Martin Luther King Jr. has to do with fair housing. And as per usual, you will have to bear with me just for a moment while I turn on the Facebook because it likes to be difficult. As I've said before, I'm live streaming both to Twitch, YouTube, and Facebook. But I have to change my settings on Facebook for everyone to be able to chat while they're watching, which is now on. So, as I promised, as you know, Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday was observed as a national holiday this past Monday. And as many of you know, I am a real estate agent for Texas Pride Realty Group, powered by Home Smart Stars here in Plano, Texas. And I wanted to talk to you a bit about tying in what Martin Luther King Jr. had to do with the fair housing laws that we currently have, or sort of lack thereof. So you're probably wondering why I even bring this up, because we still really don't have equality in housing here in this country. Everyone and everybody just can't go buy a house. There are still classes of people that can be denied housing. There are still people that can be looked upon differently or whatever, and you can't rent, you can't buy, whatever. They don't have to give you what you want when they want. There's all sorts of caveats to the fair housing laws that we do have. But up until 1968, the fair housing laws that we did have didn't cover a whole lot. You will know from your Constitution class when race was made a class, protected class in this country. You couldn't discriminate against people on the basis of race. That was the only class that was protected since the 1800s. The other classes that are under the fair housing laws were added much later. Excuse me. So the reason I wanted to bring up fair housing and Martin Luther King specifically is because the fair housing laws, or even the Civil Rights Act itself that we have since 1968, was not passed until he was killed. It languished in Congress multiple times over, and basically him being assassinated, it was what put the fire under Congress to get it done. So I want to share some things with you about that, mostly from Wikipedia, because it is law. It's pretty cut and dry as to what the laws are. Not many people know what they are, where they come from. They just hear fair housing. And I really don't understand what fair housing covers and what it doesn't cover. So bear with me for a moment while I share a screen with you. And I have to bring it up. It's going to take me a minute to do that on Restream here. Okay, the first act, obviously, we're going to look at is the Civil Rights Act of 1968. There it is. All its glory. Well, it's Wikipedia form, not its actual glory. But this is the basis of all of our civil rights laws in this country right now. Has to do with Civil Rights Act of 1968. And you will notice the date. Well, it actually follows up the Civil Rights Act of 64. Just to be clear, there were two Civil Rights Acts, and I don't want you all to think that there were just one. As you know, there are more here. The Indian Civil Rights Act. Fair housing is the part that was added in 1968. As you'll know, or try to remember, there was a Civil Rights Act of 1866, which protected everyone by race, prohibiting discrimination in housing in the federal government. Of course, there was no way to enforce that. Think about 1866. Do you think anyone really honestly cared about being discriminatory as to who they sold a home to? Probably not. So you go back just a bit we'll back up for a second. Civil Rights Act of 64, which was passed while, Martin Luther King was alive. Covered race, color, religion, sex, national origin. Later adding, it says sexual orientation and gender identity. That is not true. That is actually under sex. Well, we can go over that at a later time as to why. But the acts of 1968 are what we're going to talk about, and why it has to do with Dr. King being assassinated. As you can see right here, what happened after he was shot? There was civil unrest, which they will call riots. I think civil unrest is a better term for that. And there's also, look what's in that Civil Rights Act as well, the Anti-Riot Act. So, do you see a tie here between what should have just been civil rights and what actually the reason they signed this into law so quickly and got tacked on? If you'll recall, Martin Luther King was assassinated on, I believe it was April 4th. This law was signed April 11th. And Title 10 got tacked on, making it felony, calling the Anti-Riot Act, making a felony to travel in interstate commerce with the intent to incite, promote, encourage, participate, and carry on a riot, which dealt with their civil unrest due to Martin Luther King being killed. But at the same time, this got passed Fair Housing Act, which there are two different things with fair housing. You'll see here under the Civil Rights Act is Titles 8 and 9, which you commonly refer to as Fair Housing Act. And you also have the Housing and Urban Development Act of 1968, which has to do with the funding side, the block grants, and what you would call HUD. Anything that says HUD in front of it, that's Housing and Urban Development. That's the department. Deals with first-time home buyers, deals with Section 8, deals with block grants, all sorts of things. So, this act, the 1968 version, basically sat in Congress multiple times over before they could get it passed. And Martin Luther King being shot is what it got going. Got it going, excuse me. Pretty much. And Martin Luther King himself had been working on this for years. Actually, the reason, I don't know if you saw, Bernie Sanders actually brought this up the other day. What Martin Luther King was doing in Memphis when he was assassinated, he was marching with sanitation workers who were on strike. This whole notion that Martin Luther King was some sort of moderate right-wing figure is totally false. He's not just racial equality, but equality for everyone across the board. Equality for employment, equality for housing, everything. So he was working towards this goal to begin with before he was even killed. So let's take a look at what and there is a Housing and Community Development Act of 1974 as well later. By the way, that actually creates Section 8, since I brought up Section 8. So the Fair Housing Acts down here, and you'll see, since I brought up the one in 74, how this has progressed. So different classes of people have been added along the way to the Fair Housing Act and how they're treated and who is protected from discrimination in housing. Anything to do with housing, is controlled by the federal government. And that's where the equal opportunity, thing comes from, which as a realtor we adhere to. We do not discriminate at all. There are some realtors that might do that in their own minds or try to, even though they're not supposed to and is against law. We will not do that at Texas Pride Realty Group at all. So do not ask me to discriminate in any way. Trying to find you a home. Back to this. So the Civil Rights Act added protections against people refusing to sell or rent to anyone based on the race of their race, which was already protected, but not really. Color, religion, or national origin. So, and this is in 1968, which you'll see in this next part of the sentence. What was missing even in 1968 from discrimination against purchasing a home or anything that has to do with rentals or stuff like that? Did you notice sex? Women were discriminated against up until 1974. I know some of you and some friends of mine who are a little older and have gone through that themselves, even trying to, get credit or anything like that. If you grew up in the 70s and prior to, and you were a woman, you were expected to be married. And if you weren't, you were pretty much SOL as far as getting credit or housing or anything like that. Then you'll notice later on, 1988, with the Americans with Disabilities Acts, people with disabilities and families were added on, or actually families with children specifically. Because if you're wondering why it says families with children, there are people who would discriminate against people who have kids. Let's say they had a community they didn't want any children in, adults only, that sort of thing. That's a no-no. Now, there are only the special caveats to deal with seniors, and that's a whole other topic. So, as you can see, a lot of this was just added on just in 1968, having to deal with mostly with race, sex. LGBT issues didn't come up really until 2012 with President Obama's administration basically recognizing that sexual orientation and gender identity should be included where it says sex. It's not a law. Keep this in mind reading this paragraph too. It's still not a law. It took until 2020 for the Supreme Court to actually agree with that interpretation, that sex, as one word in the Civil Rights Act, covers both sexual orientation, gender identity, and male-female version of the word sex. Still, again, to this day, in January of 2022, it is not law. And President Biden, of course, issued a rule change again because our friend before him went backwards on that. And because there is no law that can do that. Doesn't matter. Anyone comes along, hey, one day we'll change it. Next 4 years from now, might change it again. This is why it's important to be in the laws. In case you're wondering, sidebar on LGBT issues. This is why it's important to have it in that. It's important to be in employment and, the other things that we've been talking about for years. Because you can just change on a whim whenever you feel like it. Like, just because someone interprets something one way doesn't mean they have to until it's codified in the law, which is exactly what this does in the Civil Rights Act and has to deal with fair housing. So I mentioned earlier the Anti-Riot Act that was tacked on. Got it, got it through there. Although you'll notice, thanks to our Black Lives Matters protests in 2020 and 21, parts of the Riot Act have been struck down due to free speech. Okay, there is another act, 1968. I need to share a different screen for you to see it. Sorry, just like Zoom, it takes a while to share screens. Click, 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 click. Here is the Housing and Urban Development Act of 68, which was signed not long after Civil Rights Act of 68. This one was signed in August 1st under the Johnson administration as well. Like I said, this has to do with the funding of housing. A lot of the issues with public housing is there was no funding for it. There was no public housing. And as you know, with baby boomer generation expanding, and this is in 1968, it isn't just a racial issue, it's an issue across the board as far as, providing affordable, fair housing in this country, and still to this day. You'll see that this act was dealing specifically with constructing or rehabbing 26 million housing units. 6 million were supposed to be for low and moderate income families. Even back then, this is a $5.3 billion program over 3 years, which in today's money, if I had to guess, what that would be is probably well close to $1 trillion. Let's look it up just for fun. Dollar in 1968 worth today is 801. So 8 times that. No, way less than I thought. Sorry. So we'll say 40 billion, just so I don't have to do math in my head or look at a calculator. Pretty expensive even for them. And so what this did, dealt with those programs, created Ginnie Mae financing programs, split off from Fannie Mae, put under the Housing and Urban Development and Federal Housing Administration. The FHA is what you hear when you're talking about um, loans backed by the government, especially first-time homebuyer loans. Those are FHA loans. This one mentions Section 235, which deals with the low and moderate income families. Back then was offering $200 down, and you had to have 20% of a household salary and 1% mortgage interest rate. Now, I want to point out real quick the 1% mortgage interest rate. This is 1968. There's a lot of people right now, specifically, complaining about mortgage interest rates increasing last week and in the last 24 hours, which brought it to about 3.75, depending on the bank ish. And this is in 2022, and you can still buy a house at 3.75. That's pretty damn good, don't you think? And you'll see headlines that saying, "Oh no, it's the most it's been since." Well, that since number was April of 2020, when the Fed dropped mortgage rates and all rates to save our butts in the economy and prevent a pandemic recession from going even further. Those were bottom of the barrel rates that you're probably never going to see again. But do not complain when it's 3.75. Yes, it's going to cost you a little bit more, but a lot of us have lived through rates that are double that or more. Keep that in mind. You're not going to see 8%, 7% like we did in 2007. And real quick, wanted to go over to the Housing and Community Development Act of 1974 is what created Section 8, which you'll know as low-income housing grants. Basically, they call it Entitled Communities Grants, is how it's referred to now, or even referred to then. A lot of people don't use the term Section 8. It shouldn't provide a negative connotation, but it does. And again, this is another caveat. Like I was telling you, there are caveats about who can and can't get a home. Landlords do not have to accept Section 8 vouchers. They do not. So if you have a client or a friend or family and you are on a government-backed voucher, which basically guarantees part of the rent to the landlord is going to be paid, they don't have to accept it. They don't have to take that person flat out. So keep that in mind also when talking about fair housing. All right. Let me go back here again. Stop sharing my screen. That is the gist of what I wanted to talk about today. There's an article on Vox, which let me show you the link before I let anyone go. I'm going to share again. Oh, actually, it's not going to show the link. Sorry. That's the title of it. If you go to Vox, it was written on Monday, 2 days ago, about Martin Luther King and the struggle about segregation among cities. Has to deal with reason all that money we were talking about, that was the 1968 Community and Housing Act. Basically, Richard Nixon said, no, we're not spending that. And more or less told HUD and FHA to just forget about it for a while. So even when the government tries to do something, like I said, it can be flipped around um, at any given time. So these people, were instructed back then to reject applications. And a lot of that, and this particular article deals with cities and how cities were instructed and specifically segregated races in cities. Dealing with highways. There's a lot of places here in Texas. Dallas is a good example. Austin is another example where highways are put in. One side is minority. The other side is not minority. And then they're divided by, 6-8 lane highway. Or their thriving neighborhoods were replaced by said highway. There are several instances of that, and Dallas is one of them. There's an article that I saw recently where Central Expressway actually took out a good chunk of a community which was located about where Lemon intersects with 75. The Oaklawn area, uptown is what you would call that area, I guess, right now. Thriving black community at the time, just taken out by highway just because you could. So even today, we're still dealing with these issues. The reason I brought it up again is because of Martin Luther King on Monday and his fight dealing with fair housing. We're still dealing with it today. Trying to keep people abreast of the situations, trying to make sure we don't discriminate as much as we can. Those of us who follow the law know what we're talking about. But if anyone has any questions, you can leave them in the comments in whatever spot you're watching this from, whether it's on Facebook or YouTube. Or actually on Facebook, the only place you're going to be able to leave a comment once I turn this off. I don't think you can do that on Twitch or YouTube. So that's all I have today. I'm not going to talk about anything else. So everyone have a great afternoon and great rest of your week. If you have any other questions, you can find me at coopersellshomes.com. Once again, John Turner-McClelland, Texas Pride Realty Group in Plano, Texas.